to my very special episode today of my Clarendon Chronicles Podcast. Really privileged today to have my guest, Jan Ward, and I'd like to share with the audience today what an amazing profile Jan has. Jan has more than 30 years' experience in the oil, gas, and chemical power industry. From a mechanical engineering background, Jan has lived and worked in several countries as a special instrument released. She's the founder and CEO of Corafirm International, starting with no capital from her hometown bedroom in Southampton. The company has grown to over 10 offices globally, selling to 60 countries, specializing in supplying advanced materials for fabricating oil, gas, and power generating equipment. And throughout her career, she has been a supporter of women into business and was the first woman director of the Hampshire Chamber of Commerce in the UK. She's also a past director of Women in Business International, and she's promoted women in manufacturing and engineering in addition to mentoring young businesswomen for many years, also being a director of the Energy Industries Council, the leading membership organization in the energy industry. Jan gives many voluntary hours as an advisor to government on the subject of international trade and manufacturing, culminating in joining the board of the Ministry of International Trade as a non-exec in 2013. And in the last 8 years, Jan has been closely involved as a judge in the UK Manufacturer of the Year Award and was voted an exemplar top 100 manufacturer by her peers, also serving as a judge for the NatWest Every Woman Award and also a judge for the Queen's Award for Enterprise for 5 years. Jan has won a number of business awards, among them NatWest Businesswoman of the Year, Institute of Directors Global Director of the Year, and in 2015 was awarded a CBE in the Queen's New Year's Honours List for services to business, also being awarded an honorary doctorate of engineering by Southampton Solent University. And for context, Jan and I have worked together as non-exec directors at global visual display FMCG business Optima, Jan being my chair alongside my role as chair of audit and risk. Jan, thanks for putting up with that introduction. What a profile to introduce you with. And I know it only scratches the surface. And thanks again for joining me today. I know from our time at Optima that it's always difficult to get time with you. So thanks very much for your time on my podcast. And can I start, Jan, a fairly generic question? What draws a young woman from Southampton into the really complex, not that I've got anything against Southampton, but the complex sector of engineering and technology, not necessarily the most obvious career route for a woman, and what continues to drive that enthusiasm 40 years later?
Oh, well, it's I think the clues were always there, Jeremy, let's be honest. When I was little, I used to go away and take things apart a lot, you know. I was really interested in how things worked. And I used to get into trouble for pinching bits from my dad's shed to make something. And I once stole the wheels off my sister's pram so that I could make a go-kart, you know. And I got in trouble for playing around with experiments with tin cans and fireworks and that type of thing. So,
right,
you know, I was always outdoors, and I was always, you know, involved pinching tools out of my dad's shed and stuff like that. So I think the clues were always there. But when I was at school in those days, because that was a long time ago, my careers advice was to be a hairdresser until I got married. So that basically at the time was the advice. But effectively, what I realised when I got to sort of late teens was that unless I had some proper qualifications and I was able to, you know, really gain some skills, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to get a decent job. So, you know, because by that time I'd left school early and I decided that I needed to get a job. So I did all sorts of, you know, bar jobs and worked in a booking shop, betting office. I worked in a library. I did all sorts of things, but realised that, you know, without the skills and the knowledge, I wasn't going to get anywhere. So I enrolled on an international trade course. That was the first thing I did. And I loved it, absolutely loved it. And I went all the way through to graduate in international trade. And then at the end of that, I needed to find a job that suited me in terms of, the skills that I had. So there happened to be a job advertised by a steel manufacturer in their international trade department, in their export department. And so I went for the interview and got it, which I was really surprised about. And I was desperate to get the job, so I practically begged, if I'm honest. And they gave me the job. And it was in the sales department, working in the steel manufacturing job. And it was then that I realised it was the technology that interested me. I was interested in the engineering side of it. And that's what then led me to go on to do the qualification and get more involved in engineering and manufacturing. And that's always been the thing that I've been interested in. And I think the thing that interests me about it is engineering rarely gets the right credits in terms of what you do when you are doing engineering. It's not always hands-on, but that's interesting as well for me. But ultimately, it's very creative. The whole point of engineering is to use what you know to try and be creative about solving problems and giving people solutions. So for me, it was that constant learning and moving forward, and it's still like that now. Engineering never stands still. It's always moving forward, and at the moment, especially over the last 10 years, especially, engineering has gone really, really into the advanced areas. The barriers that we're trying to break down in the things that we want our engineering products to achieve have just blossomed, and it's brought out lots and lots of talent. So for me, just keeping abreast of the developments in manufacturing and technology and what engineering is doing just is still fascinating, and every day's a school day for me, so it keeps me interested.
I think what you've said, Jan, is you demonstrated that I made exactly the right decision to get my engineering degree, which is equally a long time ago, and decide that it's not for me. Because what you described there is I never had that level of interest to how things work. I managed to pass the exams, and I appreciate you kind of you've given us a really short version of your career then. And I'm going to come on to some of the things which you've done as well. I mean, you mentioned going for that job there, Jan. I'm guessing, and your course and the qualification of international trade. Have you seen the sector change for women in particular? I'm guessing that you might have been one of only a few people on that international course. I remember on my engineering degree, I think we had 60 or 70 on in my year. I think 5 were women. How have you seen that change? And is there still a problem about getting women into engineering and technology?
I think it's less of a problem than it was, because if you go back a few years, basically it wasn't even offered as an option. It wasn't something that girls ever thought about as being something they could do. But I think at the moment, the image of engineering and the image of manufacturing in general is not correct. What is being advised at career level now in careers advice, I think, is not really portraying the industry the way that it actually is now. They tend to constantly put images of people on site in hard hats, and that's not how it is anymore. If you take, for example, one small part of the things that have increased in increased in their abilities, let's say 3D printing is something that it's not that new, to be honest. It's been around a long time, but it's taken off and it has been adopted now. And the technology enables people to print things in so many different materials for so many different applications now that it's really becoming not exactly the norm, but it's being used far more widely than it ever was. Well, to be able to do 3D printing, you don't have to have a hard hat. Basically, you need to have to be really, really good at CAD, and you need to be able to get that CAD drawing translated. So it's basically an IT job now, but you have to have engineering skills to be able to do the design. and to understand how that's going to come together and work out whether or not that product is actually going to be able to do the job that you're printing it for. So for me, I think there's still that wrong image that puts girls off. And I think that everybody thinks it's hard. That's the other thing with going into engineering and going into manufacturing. It's, if I can do it, anybody can do it. It's not difficult. It's just that it's portrayed as, you've got to have a really good level of maths, and you've got to understand physics, and all of this. And yes, you do, but it's not as difficult. It's logical. It's very logical. Sorry about this. Let me just turn this off. I don't know.
Don't worry. I think that visibility thing is absolutely right, and you still see it now, even with politicians. They, high vis jacket and hard hat if they're visiting place in the Midlands or the North. It's always the same, isn't it? It's, whatever party, high vis jacket, hard hat equals factory and production and technology. How does that differ internationally, Jan? Because you work all over the world. You've got a special interest in the Middle East. How is it different? Is it different in international circumstances?
Sorry, Jeremy, can you hear that outside?
I can. I'll probably. I can. I might cut this bit out, but it's just a little bit.
Hang on. I can't do anything about it. It's the farmer. He's right outside my window with a bloody mower. Sorry.
We'll carry on. We'll carry on.
Okay.
Because it's the content. Is it different? Because I think I've worked internationally, but you've worked like what I would call proper internationally. So is it different? Is it different, particularly in the Middle East, for example? I'm sure people are quite interested to know how it works with women, with manufacturing and industry in the Middle East, for example.
Right, okay. Well, there is a big difference between the Gulf states and the sort of Levant states, if you like. So places like Syria, Jordan to a certain extent, certainly Iraq and Iran, women are encouraged to go into industry. Just to give you an example, probably 15, 16 years ago, I walked into an office of a chemical engineering company, and every engineer in the building was a woman. So, and that was in Iran. I think
listeners will be quite surprised to hear that, because
exactly.
my guess when you were just going to tell it would be they'd all be male. No, but that's not the case then.
No. And they were very, very proud of their young chemical engineers. They were really, really proud of them. There were men around, I'm sure, but everybody that I met, and it wasn't contrived because they didn't know I was coming. So they didn't deliberately roll out their women because I was there. They basically, these were the youngsters that were in the building, and they were qualified from university as chemical engineers, and that was the job they were doing. And that is encouraged in those areas. If you go down to the Gulf states, they are much, much better than they were. But they still have a long way to go. They're probably 10 years behind.
So this is, for example, the UAE.
Yeah, UAE, Saudi, Qatar, Oman, those areas. Yes, women are much more liberated now. Saudi, the culture has stopped them. Their culture, they don't want. They don't want, the women don't want to be involved in industry a lot of the time, but the ones that do are able to now, which they didn't before. That's a big change over the last 5-6 years.
Yeah, I see.
And it's not because they're being told they can't, it's because they actually don't want to.
Yeah, and you've got all this experience in international business. And as you said, going into international trade, doing a qualification, and getting a first role in international business. But you then founded your own company, Jan. So Corotherm International, how did, and it's very successful, as you and I both know, and I imagine you weren't born with a CBE. So how, what drove you to set up your own business? So I think we're probably getting a sense of the determination and the enthusiasm, but what took you, and how big of a risk was it, I guess, in setting up Corotherm from what you were doing?
Well, the industry that I was approaching and the sector that I wanted to operate in was very well known to me. I'd already worked in it for quite a long time for other companies. So it wasn't as if I was going into something that I didn't understand and didn't have a network in, because I did. So that made it less risky. But the reason that I wanted to do it was because I didn't like corporate behaviour. I mean, bearing in mind this was 30 years ago, I think corporate behaviour possibly is better now in some areas, but I've still heard some really nasty horror stories about the way that corporates treat their people. But my biggest issue was the way that they treated their staff, the way that they wasted the talent, that they lost people when they didn't need to because of the way that they behaved. And so for me, the big driver was I wanted to have a business that people wanted to work in, that people liked to come to work. I mean, not every day. I mean, that's just unrealistic. There are days when you will not have a good day and you're not necessarily going to enjoy it. But ultimately, you want to work for this company and that they treat you well, and that you are, you're getting as much out of the career that you've got as you can. So that was the real driver for me, because the way that I found corporate people treated, the executives treated their staff was appalling then. It was really, really awful. So I just I didn't want to work in that, and I didn't want to be the instrument, because by that time I'd run a couple of companies within a group, and the board made a decision and I had to implement it, and I just didn't want to anymore. I just didn't want to do it anymore. So that was the main reason for doing it.
I don't think anybody's ever given me the answer before, Jan, on my conversations. When in a good way, because people have said, I wanted to develop something, or I want to create an organization. I don't think anybody's ever said, do you know what, I actually want to do it for those reasons. So fascinating insight. And what you founded Corotherm. Lots of people watching this will have heard, when people set up a business, alongside the way to run an organization, as you described, people will have heard the questions being asked. What problem in the market are you solving? What's your solution? Why is your solution better than anybody else's? So what marks out Corotherm as being a leader in its field, either then or in the run up to today, Jan?
I think it's because we were in a niche market where there were very few competitors, and still are very few competitors. The expertise within the business, and the fact that the region that we were concentrating on in the early days, which has expanded now, was the Middle East, which is where my expertise lied, because I specialised in dealing with the Middle East. Because when I started in the business, in that sector, the Middle East was booming. There were masses and masses of projects going on in the Middle East, because they were founding what is now the oil industry there. They were expanding in every area, and they were starting also the other big opening sort of door that I found in the Middle East was that they wanted expertise but didn't have it. And the area that we operate in, which is very specialised in a specific type of material that go into very critical applications, there's a lot of knowledge needed to be able to do this. So the areas that they were going into, rather than just pumping crude oil, they wanted to process it. They wanted the oil to be made into higher value products. And to be able to do that, you have to work in much higher conditions, much higher pressures, higher temperatures, more corrosion. And that's where we came in and their expertise didn't exist in the Middle East then. So we were fulfilling a need that was there, that was actually very badly served by the current suppliers at the time. And we filled that gap, really. And the reason that we were able to do it, and the big driver, was the fact that we had the expertise, and that was very rare. Then and even now.
And how has it changed? So presumably, if that was 20 or 30 years ago, how has have you, there's that phrase at the moment where people have to pivot. How often have you had to redevelop and pivot in your, and is it still happening?
Yes, yeah. The products themselves, the materials haven't really developed hugely since. There's been a couple of really useful innovations. There's been some absolutely useless innovations that never got off the ground. But ultimately, we've had to pivot in the terms of which sector and the end use of the product. So in the early days, it was mostly just petrochemical, and we've had to move away from the type of product. So, for example, we've had to get involved in cladding material. We've had to get involved in more complicated fabrications, and there's a much wider use now in lots of different applications that are outside the oil and gas industry. The oil and gas industry now is a very small part, actually, of our customer base. So, we've had to just, it's just as in anything with engineering, it's constantly on the move, because people are always trying to do things smarter, for less money, more effectively, more productively. And so these products are being used in far wider applications now. So we just have to watch where that goes and make sure that we either follow or we try to lead in some cases. In the early days, we were leading. We were introducing products into the Middle East that didn't exist there at the time. They didn't know that they were available. So, for example, if you needed to change out the tubes from a heat exchanger, they were using a stainless steel that was lasting maybe 6 months, and we brought a product to the marketplace that would last at least 10 years. So, in some ways, you're almost doing yourself a disfavour by taking some of these products in. But once that product was accepted, and that took a lot of work to get it approved, once that was done, then we were selling that product to everybody that was using that for the same application.
It sounds amazing what you've managed to achieve, Jan. And I know, again, we've only scratched the surface. People watching this will have heard some of your thoughts already, and will undoubtedly be thinking, how can I do that? Because you talked about corporate behavior, starting from nothing, conquering some incredibly difficult markets with new products and new solutions and new sectors. So let me ask you this, Jan. And people wanting to be a founder and an entrepreneur, what crucial pieces of advice would you give to budding and indeed existing entrepreneurs? Because I've had a few people on the podcast. How you managed to do it, and I'm sure there's been plenty of bumps in the road. What advice would you give to the listeners?
Okay, well, depending on what stage you're at, I suppose. But in the early days, if you're planning to start, it's going to take twice as long as you think it's going to take to come to profit. So when you are putting together your financial planning, make the worst case scenario the one that you use. And so when you go out for funding, that you are being realistic about how long this is actually going to take before you start turning a profit. Make sure, the other big one that I learned is make sure that you know your numbers. Close the month every month. Even if you've only spent money and never earned anything, know exactly where you are with your cash and with your P&L and your balance sheet. That is absolutely vital, and that's something I cling to even today, I am very uncomfortable until I get the end of month figures and I know exactly where we are. Then learn how to forecast and make sure that you are not having a fantasy forecast because it's making you feel good. Make sure that it's a realistic forecast. Develop your relationship with the bank. Make sure that you've got a good relationship with the bank, and don't tell the bank something that you can't do. And don't be speculative with the bank. Be honest with them, be open and tell them what's going on. If you've got problems, tell them. They'll be able to help you. They're not the enemy. I think the other thing is, if you are starting a business because you think it's going to give you a rich lifestyle and you're going to be able to spend more time with your family, don't do it, because that's not how it works. 30 years later, I'm quite lucky because I've got a great team. But ultimately, bottom line, it would be quite easy for me to go back in and just still be doing 30 hours a day. You're not going to get an easy time of it, even if the business matures. It's not easy to make a small business into a bigger business that allows you to have time off. The bigger it gets, the more responsibility you've got, and the harder work it is. But if you enjoy it, it's not the trial that it sounds. It's great, but you have to enjoy it. And if you like hard work and you don't mind all of the disruption that it causes to your family life, then you'll be fine. But if you want to start at 9 and finish at 5, then it's not for you.
I think there's some fantastic piece of advice there. I think I was looking for 3. I think there were 5 or 6 gems in there. I mean, with my background, of course I would say this, but I particularly like the idea of realistic forecasting, and having been involved in helping out younger businesses, sort of aspirational individuals and businesses, the idea that it will all come right in year 3, because it's always year 3, isn't it? It's never year 2. It's always year 3 that things tend to go off the scale. But you try to put some logic behind it, don't you? Around, well, what's going to make that the case? Are you taking share? Are you creating share? Are you entering a new market? And sometimes the answers you just get back are, we've got a great bunch of people, we're going to run faster and work harder. And I suspect there's a bit more to it than that. I mean, you're the entrepreneur, not me. But it is that, what are you hanging your framework on? But I really appreciate that. Always do the numbers. Always make sure you have sleep at night cash if you have, and have that great open and honest relationship with, if it's a banker, if it's a funder, if it's an investor. Tell them warts and all is what I suggest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Jan, we've worked together for nearly 4 years actually at Optima, with a great business there as well, with you as chair. So we've got to know each other fairly well. So I hope you don't mind me asking the following question. So you and I are probably both at the stage where we could potentially think about slowing down and doing less to a certain extent. With you, Jan, I don't see that at all. And hence the way that you've spoken about that. So what's behind that? What's the drive to achieve? What's left in it for you with Coratherm, with other things, with international trade? I know you attend lots and lots of things which fall into that, well, a loosely termed networking category, advisor to government, working with international trade, helping all sorts of opportunities with trade. What's behind that, Jan? Because you're still full on, let's say.
Oh yes, I think I'm probably working more hours now than I did 25 years ago, to be honest. But I think the first and foremost problem is I have a problem saying no to something that's really interesting. The things that I've become involved in over the last sort of 18 months or so have been things that I've been asked to do. So I've not been going out looking, but I've been asked if I'd be interested. And there's been a couple of things that I've been asked to do, and I've thought, no, they're not for me. They're not going to be the effective things that I'd like to do. But there've been some really interesting things. I mean, one of the main ones that I'm really keen on trying to work with is the Floating Offshore Wind Commission. that I chair. And the other thing is I'm chairing CallServe, which is a technical company owned by Cornwall Council, and the Freeport. So those three things are irresistible for me. You know, they're things that I just couldn't say no to, because they were just so effective in what they are trying to do. And I think that's the thing that drives me. I've just got this desire to make a difference, I suppose. Is, you know, how can I change this for the better? How can I bring value? You know, what's the value that I'm bringing to this project or to this company? And I think that's the big thing. And just trying to make a change, I think, and make things work. I find it very, very difficult. That's an engineering thing in me, I suppose. Is if things aren't working, I've got to try and make it work somehow. And I'm doing it with policy and with companies, and, you know, in theory now, as opposed to actually taking a piece of engineering kit and trying to make it work.
And for the avoidance of doubt, Jan, just in case anybody's wondering whether you don't have anything else to do, I know you do have lots of things that you do. So you go sailing a lot, I know. And I imagine some of those, and correct me if I'm wrong, but those 2 or 3 last 18-month roles that you described, I suspect they're not going to make you wealthy either. That's done for change.
No, they're not. You know, they're not. It's not really. If it was about the money, I'd be doing something completely different.
Yeah. Fantastic insights. Jan, thank you so much for sharing this time with me today. I think in 30 minutes or so, anybody watching this will have learned such a great deal about wanting to run their own business, how you start from scratch, how you enter and cement your place in international markets. Thank you so much for sharing that with me today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you on this edition of my Clarendon Chronicles podcast. Thank you so much for your time, Jan. I know we had the mower outside the window.
Yeah,
I think we'll keep that in, Jan, because it's a natural conversation. And my technical skills are okay, but it does take me a little bit of time to edit. So thanks again, Jan. Really appreciate your time this morning.
Great. It's been great to talk to you, Jeremy. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. For everybody watching, do look out for my next episode coming soon. And in the meantime, bye for now.